Hello everyone, today we talk about the Battle of Harran, fought on May the 7th, 1104, between the Crusader states of the Principality of Antioch and the County of Edessa and the Seljuk Turks. Right? It was the first major battle against the newfound Crusader states in the aftermath of the First Crusade, marking a key turning point against Frankish expansion. And this battle would have a disastrous effect on the Principality of Antioch as the Turks regained territory earlier lost. Today we talk, as always, about the tactical development of the battle. Right? We don't give much of a strategical background, if not for explaining the general intention of the contendants. And I got interested in this battle that I admit I had never studied before, as most of Crusader battles, and I began to read the sources just from a couple of days making this video, and I got interested in it because I began to read about it on studies, including, Runciman, for example, but also more specific books. And I got interested and said, okay, every time I make a battle video, I eventually go look at the sources of the battle, especially when they are so relatively few, as in this case, which is not completely true. If you wanna like a list of the sources, as we'll see now, that there is Albert of A or Aachen, Radulf of Caen, Fulcar of Chartres, Ibn al-Qualanisi, Ibn al-Hamir, Sibt ibn al-Juadzi, Matthew of Edessa, Michael the Syrian, another anonymous Syrian chronicle, etc. The most important sources being, though, Albert of Aachen and Radulf of Caen, but as well as actually I've read all of these except the last two Muslim ones and especially the last anonymous chronicle, but that's not suggested as at least the most important of the sources. And this is not good for tactical analysis because in theory I should have covered everything. But aside from the fact that I simply couldn't find some of the sources, some of the secondary ones, though the most important are all here, I noticed in fact that most of them are not so rich in details, right? And in fact the most important ones being the ones that we'll read today, that is Albert of Aachen, Ralph of Caen, Matthew of Edessa. We could also read Fulcarius of Chartres or Ibn al-Qualanisi, right, that however do not really add much, if not to the amount of losses. For example, I was curious about the Islamic sources, and it introduced the event in fair detail, and then eventually it simply bypasses the battle, saying, okay, well, the Turks won. It doesn't even tell you how it went, right? So, and it tells there were 10,000 losses, etc. So the understanding I have for having gotten acquainted with this battle so recently, and that this has been confirmed also by the studies I've read, is that fundamentally the most important sources are Albert of Aachen, Ralph of Caen, and Matthew of Edessa. And the thing that struck me the most actually is the relative discrepancy that exists between the most shared, the most credited version, that I suspect being actually the one by Runciman, and that is followed also by these other studies that I followed, as well as on YouTube by the multiple videos that I found on the battle that basically tell it in 3 minutes, and they sound very much like the tale of the story and how this battle allegedly went. And once again, I suspect it's after Runciman's version. They simply read the study and they didn't look at the sources. But I had this interest, and the discrepancy and discrepancy said, in fact, with what the sources really tell, right? In part, I haven't even found part of the information that I found in Runciman, for example, and I suspect that this could be connected with the fact that I haven't read like all the sources, even if the rest were just secondary ones. So maybe a detail could have been in them, right? So that's why I do these things on YouTube, but I would never do it in an article, for example. It's really more than that, because the sources that I checked really tell a bit different things that are, first of all, not always clear, as most battle accounts of the time, but also that, in terms of what they tell clearly, they tell a different version of the story. In fact, the same Runciman here states the accounts of the actual battle are somewhat conflicting, but I would say that because they draw a picture that may not be so crystalline clear as it's interpreted, and the most credited version substantially talks about, so bit of strategic background, then we go to the development proper. So there was an attack, a Turkish attack on Edessa by Sukman ibn-Ortoq of Mardin and Yakarmish of Mosul. So at this point, the armies of Edessa and Antioch, under Count Baldwin II of Antioch, Baldwin II of the book, and the Prince Bohemond of Antioch, Bohemond of Taranto, invested the city of Harran to distract the Turks from Edessa, right? And in fact, before the Crusaders could occupy the town, the Turkish army, having abandoned the siege of Edessa herself, arrived in Harran and they split their army in two bodies, one of which revictualled the city, while the other advanced to occupy the besieging army, drawing it away from the city by a feigned flight, right? So even in here, we will not venture into the strategic background, because even in here we will read something about it now from the sources, but it's not completely clear. I think that what happened, really, in my opinion, is that literally, the Crusader army left some troops at besieging Harran, and then the bulk of it went after the Turks that probably attracted them somewhere in this regard. But I am not entirely sure of whether the feigned flight, Turkish feigned flight, happened during or also during the battle, which is not completely clear, but we will be seeing it afterwards. So this is fundamentally the picture. About the numbers, we have from Albert of Aachen, 3,000 cavalry and more than 7,000 infantry among the Franks, including many Armenians. Whereas from the Turkic side, the numbers say up to 30,000, right? So this is the normal 1 to 3 ratio that you find very often in the Western chronicles about the numerical proportions of these crusading battles. The idea that the Crusaders were often outnumbered because they had kind of superior quality, on average heavier troops, and therefore that was already an enormous strategic asset. Certain standards, and the Muslims were stereotypically more, which is possible and plausible during this battle, and also considering the fact that this is largely true, that most Islamic armies during Crusades had lighter troops on average, larger bodies of horse archers that were renownedly working as on the base of their mass and their volume of fire, and that were to retreat on more favorable ground where the heavier Muslim troops could eventually strike the worn out Crusaders, right? But the odds in this regard were pretty balanced most of the times, right? And this crusading and Islamic armies were in practice much more similar than it's often portrayed, but at the same time that this balance is still, this dynamics is still reliable, generally speaking, as a pattern of interpretation. So the most credited version substantially pictures this, that fundamentally there were two parts of the Crusader army. The one of the Edessans under Baldwin and one of the Antiochians under Bohemond and also Tancred. and we will see that already from the sources. This is not always pictured in like they were like half and half, or at least just two blocks, but possibly there was a third one, and that fundamentally the Edessens had advanced across a river. That is the Balik one, albeit the sources often say the Kobar, which is I think it's more east than that, but anyway, this is not a big deal. And so that the Turks attracted the Edessens, right, across the river, and fundamentally attacked them from the side, while the Crusaders had advanced enough against the main Turkish, the visible Turkish body, eventually attacked from the flank that way, right, and wiped out. And then fundamentally that the Antiochians actually were stationed behind the river and behind a small hill that I've not found any evidence for in the sources I've read, and that they basically engaged a small party of Turks that even here the credited version doesn't quite explain why they would be. I mean, I think I understand why they say that from a source, but I don't think it actually speaks for what the source was meaning in that regard. And when they acknowledged that the Edessens had been wiped out, they basically retreated, right? They managed to escape largely. Baldwin was taken captive together with most of the Edessens. The Antiochians instead suffered allegedly less losses, or probably actually, and that's basically the battle. And this credited version states that fundamentally the Antiochians had been deployed in this posterior position, concealed by the hill, to attempt essentially to perform the same Turkish tactic of feigned flight, or at least sort of attracting the, coming out and take by surprise the Turks, which actually we don't know much about the field of battle. We know of this river, of this. I don't know of this hill, frankly, but the whole thing doesn't sound particularly logical, given that if this normally the ambush parties are in a kind of a bit of a posterior position, but they're still kind of close to the main army, and they kind of observe the situation, and they can enter the attack at a certain point. Here also, if the Antiochian army had been stationed behind the river, it would have taken a while before they had surpassed the hill, crossed the river, and what kind of actual surprise that would have entailed. That would have happened if only the Edessene left had been destroyed and the Turks had retreated, and up to the point even behind the river, so these are probably large spaces, not also very, very distant, and also would you use heavy cavalry of sort plus infantry to perform a maneuver like that? Like, it doesn't make any sense to me. Like, if you have an army of horse archers like the Turks do, in swarms, you can't do that. This is actually what happened, even not just at a tactical level, but strategically speaking, because probably the crusading army had been attracted out of Harran on this difficult terrain. It surely was, right? So it resembles a bit the Battle of Manzikert we made video on, that the Crusaders basically marched all the day long. And we'll see that the thing comes in here, because one source explicitly says that the battle fundamentally was fought over one day, but still the retreat happened also overnight and during the night. So it's actually very similar in that regard, and in fact I like that source very much. We'll read it in a while. And this mechanism doesn't quite sound right, and I don't think there is an actual evidence of any sort in the sources, nor explicit, at least for what I've read, nor implicit for the picture here. It is true that sometimes the Western sources hide the concept of feigned flight, or ambushes, whether, these things were probably not so, uncommon even before the beginning of the 13th century, where the Western armies began quite openly to perform these attacks from the flank with concealed parties, etc. But they're a bit of a different thing. Here we're talking about two entire divisions, and there is no specific evidence, in my opinion, at least for what I've seen, I repeat, to draw a picture like that. And for this very reason, I think we can pass directly to Albert of Aachen, right? The sources we read today are all contemporary to the events. These are sources, these people were all born in the second half of the 11th century and living through the 12th, the beginning of the 12th, and they're fundamentally contemporaries to the events. And so here, actually, I haven't found a proper translation of Albert of Aachen, so we should be reading it in Latin, and it's actually simple, but sorry that you can't follow me more easily in this regard. So I will try to paraphrase it for you, and then at least the specific Latin expressions that are important for understanding how the battle went. We will be explaining them, translating them directly. So, first of all, this Albert of Aachen, as I was saying before, is credited a bit as the most important source of the battle, and as far as I understood, that the credited version of the battle is fundamentally modeled over this account. And I repeat, it doesn't seem to me that, there is maybe space for speculation in that sense that we had just explained, but not quite what is being suggested, right? So here, well, the source begins with the strategic intro, let's say, and there is not much to add, except here it says, notice that the invading Turkish armies would have been something like 60,000 Turkish horsemen, right? So more than 30,000 we were saying before, but at least that's what appears eventually in the battle. So I guess that this is also the base on which the idea is modeled, that the Turks split the forces, right, between those who were victualling Harran and those who instead drew the Christians into battle. But the point is that naturally this armies of this size didn't exist at that point in the area, and in general, and not only there actually, and this is an exaggeration naturally, that however tells that at least the Turks had come in very large forces after all. And then it goes on and says that the Edessans called for Bohemond, that comes into help, and Tancred was this other Italo-Norman. And it says that the crusading armies stationed, they were attracted fundamentally out of Harran, and they essentially encamped by the banks of the Balik river, and after having spent the night there, at sunrise, the Crusaders, here it doesn't specifically say like just the Edessans or the Antiochians, right? It says they basically moved their encampment, right, and they established themselves in planitia, in Latin says, so probably in flatland, in the front. So here it's implicit that they crossed the river, where in another, like that they were stationed there, they on the river bank, then they go out there in the plain. So in here there is no other reference to the river in that regard during the battle, so we have to assume that was the case. And here the troops communicated themselves, and it says et acies viginti componentes. So basically there were 20 units, right, that given the 3,000 knights and 7,000 Armenians that the sources talk about, would have been something like 150 right? So basically 3 companies, we could say, of knights per each. So this is pretty large army, right? This was pretty large engagement after all. And here the source says that that's properly when the Christians split themselves between the left and the right. The fact that there are 20 ashes here, and therefore not an odd number, suggests properly that the source is talking about, two, like a true left and right. It doesn't say there were 10 ranks per each side, but it at least at this point, it seems that the army was split in two, right? And since this is the moment when the crusading army was split in two, when the ranks were formed for battle, it seems pretty evident that they had both crossed the river at that point. They were the ones at least who had had stationed in the night over the river banks. Then in the morning before they entered the plain. So there is once again no evidence that one of the two sides was behind the river at this point, right? And it even says something more important, that it says that these two, like it says, ad dextris et sinistris constituerunt ad resistendum inimicis et subvenientum socis Christianis, et quasic levius belli onus sustinerent. So what does this mean? Well, this means substantially that, at least literally, that they split themselves in two after having composed their ranks in order to resist the enemies, right, and waiting for other Christian allies, reinforcements. It says et subveniendum socis Christianis, so literally waiting for, right? So even in here, that idea that the Christians were so active to mount up who knows which stratagem doesn't quite seem like. It seems like a normal deployment in a situation in which we will see better from other sources were also not properly good, because the Turks had attracted the Crusaders on a terrain, and probably that was bad for them, far away from their supplies centers, stretching their supply lines, and also, probably under some fire. But we'll see it better in the other sources, because the Turks had done a bit like with the Byzantines and Manzikert. They had harassed constantly with horse archers who were all around. The way you imagine these battles, it's not that the armies do not. They're actually pretty close, right? And the Turkish horse archers harassed the Christian advance like all time long, right? We've seen it also for the Battle of Aten and so on. So the idea was to wear out this bulky crusading army and to make him give battle on a favored terrain, right? And we'll see that the Turks properly at this point had not properly feigned a flight, right? Strategically speaking, they had attracted the troops there, but there is no clear evidence of this being done tactically speaking during the combat of the main engagement. And even more, it says here, et quasic levius belli onus sustinent, simply means that they were waiting for these reinforcements and deployed in this way so that they could suffer better the enemy onslaught. Basically, that's what it means conceptually. And here it says even in Latin, vix acies ordinate erant et ecce soco manus in dextrum latus cum triginta milibus forsum pugnatorum ac sagittariorum bellum committere audaci impetu et tubarum orisono strepito appropinquabat, and so on. A bit of rhetoric here. But the important thing is here it says vix acies ordinate erant. So vix means hardly, scarcely, not easily, right? And ordinate erant were ordered, right? From the crusading side, unit, because that's what the sources is being speaking up to now. So that Sukuman attacks here it says in dextrum latus, right? And here, honestly, I don't completely understand whose right side, right? It could be the Turkish one, so on the Crusaders' left, or against, probably on the Crusader right, so against the Antiochians in that regard, as we will see now, because what we haven't said is, but it's pretty clear, and it's confirmed also by this source more ahead, and by others, that the Edessens were on the left and the Antiochians were on the right. And here, 30,000 men, given that we have not much of another number about the quantity of troops engaged in combat here, it seems like we don't. It seems like apparently the entire Turkish army, albeit as we've seen the source before says that there were double numbers of Turks that had invaded the county of Edessa in that regard. So here it may sound actually like, yes, that there was only a part of these, especially as we will see later on that the enemies concealed at least a part of their troops. But it still sounds like the whole freaking army, like 30,000. It's not just a tiny part of the troops. And it says 30,000 between Pugnatores, here it says, and Sagittari, which basically stands for, given that stereotypically Turkish armies were conceived as all cavalry, or mainly cavalry, here it says basically melee cavalry and horse archers, right? So definitely this is realistic. I mean, it's the normal composition of a Turkish army after all. A shock element in a skirmishing element. And bellum committere audace impetus, so that the Sokoman was attacking, was giving battle and attacking, boldly. And then here, like, obviously there's a bit of special effects, the trumpets, the noise, which is an important side of the story actually, because psychologically speaking, these armies were, a very fearful host, and especially Muslim armies had all a musical tradition that impressed the Crusaders, something that existed in the Near East and Middle East since millennia, much more than properly, not just as a form of communication, like also the Crusaders would do the same. I mean, they also had their horns, their shouts, their war cries, etc. But in there, in the Muslim armies, this was, if you want, much more scenographic, and connected also to these extremely rapid movements, especially of the horse archers, all together in swarms, in whirlwinds, and so on. But this is, however, another side of the story. So basically, the picture we have read now from Albert is that the Crusaders have come forth to give battle to the Turks in open ground, and even if the Turks wouldn't attack them while they were stationed on the river banks, here it doesn't actually says that the river bank, from which side of the bank they had deployed. Probably they had put camp probably from the the friendly side, right? From the not from the side of the Turks. But anyhow, there is no hint here that the Turks would have attacked them. So it properly, also in line with the strategic picture, the Crusaders were going for fighting with the Turks. So the Turks instead were retreating up to that point, and now instead they give battle. So properly, at this point, the Turks feel confident to have worn out the Crusaders enough to finally attack them in open battle. And the Christian tactic here is waiting and seeing what happens. In fact, here, the strategic, strategically speaking, the initiative was up to the Crusaders, but tactically now, the engagement is started by the Turks. And here the source says that Bohemond, Tancred, and all the Antiochian militia that were not active, right? And here I haven't fully understood what it concretely means, but it says because it says Ilim Fashem, so it sounds all like they attacked straight against the Turks in this regard, and the also they say that they take up arms and and helmets and an armor and also this sort of testudo, like with the shields, ad obsistendum intubis et cornibus fortiter exclamantes properabant. So here it says, I'm not entirely sure of how to translate this passage overall, because I admit that it's the one that has given me a bit more of trouble of interpretation, but it sounds properly, even in here, that the Antiochians decide fundamentally to, they hurry up to give battle. Well, armed in this regard, also it's interesting, it's kind of knightly shield wall, right? That is witnessed in Western tactics against the horse archery, right? Since, I don't know, times of the Magyars or even before, and in this case against the Turks, right? So this may be interpreted maybe really as a sense that the Antiochians were kind of not completely ready. We have seen before Vix Ashes Ordinata Eran, so barely these units had taken had been ordered for battle, so this may sound like the Antiochians were not completely ready yet, but that nevertheless they go there fully armed to, they hurry up to go into the fight. Then Albert goes against from the side of the Edessens and says, a sinistris vero Baldevinus de Burg, Gozelinus de Cortona, que de turbaisel quod dono ipsius Baldevino in beneficio tenebat, loricati occurrerunt in lanceis et gladiis et equis rapidissimis, inc et inc fortiter tubis et cornibus intonantes et praeria committentes. So here says basically that the left, the crusading left, enters in combat as well. So they give battle at the same time. And then it passes once again on the right. It says that Bohemond and Tancred, quo in dextro latere cum ostibus luctabantur, so we were fighting. So by now, in a way or another, with the enemies on the right, on the crusading right, Deo miserante, so God willing, ceperunt prevalere, ostas invadere et sternere donec virtus eorum imminuta est et ipsi fugam inierunt. Right. So here it says basically the Antiochians managed to defeat on their right, on the right of the crusading army, the Turks that they found them, that had started the engagement with. It says ceciderunt turcorum quingenti milites in eodem prelio, quod in dextro Bohemondus agebat, Christiani ferme ducenti interempti sunt. So it says that in this clash on the crusading right between the Antiochians and the Turks, the Christians had killed 500, here it says milites, but that's a generic term, could be just for not knights, but any mounted fighter of the Turks, Turcorum, in this clash, while the Christians were killed in 200. Now, something important here says, quod in dextro Bohemondus agebat. So here is referring, compared to the previous phrase that says, that couples Bohemond with Tancred, right? Here's talk just about Bohemond. Let's keep it in mind, because eventually that will come useful. Then Albert passes once again to the crusading left, and he says, Baldevinus vero de Burg Gozelinus. Gozelinus is Jocelyn, like he was the son, the brother-in-law of Baldwin de Burgh, right? So they were the essence. So Gozelinus de Cortona et ceteri egregi milites plus miliari ab Bohemundo cum sua acere moti. And this is important because it says literally that the Edessens, or more specifically, properly Baldwin, Jocelyn, and other great knights, in this case, because Cesare Egregi Milites stands for, properly the knights in this. The Egregi are even the high nobility. It's in some levels in relative terms in this case. It says, so it doesn't say completely like it doesn't even say on the left here. It just maintains their name. But the important thing explicitly that it says is also that they were more than 1 mile, fundamentally, far from the Antiochene ranks, from the ranks of Bohemond. Right? So this is a very important information because it gives an idea that there were more kilometers separating the Edessens and the Antiochenes during the battle, which is actually normal, right? Or better, maybe this distance is not so normal, because normally ranks were separated. They needed their space for maneuvering and not causing kind of domino effects because of a possible rout. We know that we have seen it in other crusading battles that the array could be, in echelons, with this, in depth, for example, in a diagonal sense. But here, like, these two chunks are pretty far from each other, right? They don't seem to see each other. In fact, the text goes on and says audientes. So the subject here is the Edessens. Boemundum et Tancradum iam bellum committere et prevalere, velocitate quorum densatas et obsistences aces rapido impeto irrumpere et atterrere conati sunt. Inter acem Boemundi et Tancradi sociari et misceri ad auxilium ferventes. So what does this mean? So hearing, not seeing, audientes, right? So hearing that Bohemond and Tancred had already entered into, already given battle, started to fight, and they were even prevailing, right? So they hear of it, right? And we can imagine naturally messengers that were running back and forth to communicate from one side of the other. It says speedily they conati sunt, right, to attack and wear out the here I translated actually the enemy ranks, like the aches refer to the ones of the Turks, right? Unless it because it says densatas et obsistentes. So densatas means to be, thickly packed. I mean, that has properly, increased its density. And obsistentes refer to the ranks that they found opposed to them. So they try to conadisum to, in fact, irrumpere et atterrere these enemies that they had in front of them, right? In order to, since they were eager, ferventes, to rejoin and mingle ad auxilium, so to help even, right? So the inter acem, so in the rank of Bohemond and Tancred. Now this is interesting. For which reason? Well, a series of reasons. So the fact that the Edessens had heard that the Antiochenes had already joined battle and they wanted to break through the enemy lines to actually anyhow reach the Antiochenes. It's kind of strange in terms of military logic, right? Here it sounds a bit like they wanted to emulate the Antiochenes, right? They had started battle, right? And the Antiochenes were getting the upper hand over the Turks. So naturally here, as you know, the Crusader leaders were all very, very jealous about each other. They wanted to prevail and so on. And they tried to attack, to break the enemies so that they could rejoin, reach the Antiochenes as well. The point, though, is that, of course, the line of battle develops, horizontally. Like theoretically, we have seen here that there is no evidence that the Edessens and the Antiochenes were at different depths of the battlefield. And even more, if they, at essence, want to break through the enemy lines to eventually reach the Antiochians, right? It doesn't sound like, why would they have done that, right? They wanted to reach them by breaking through the Turks and, like, kind of, this is justified only if you think that the Antiochians would have advanced in the process, right? So they had gone even, beyond the, in depth from the Turkish side. But there is no evidence of that as well, right? And also the weird thing is, says, to go out ad auxilium, so I mean to help the Antiochians, right? And this is kind of strange because those guys had been winning, right? So why would you help them? Like, in this sense, yes, evidently, you are in a battlefield, you're in a situation in which you want to give help to those people maybe had broken through the enemy lines where there was still danger around, so that's even possible, but it's not entirely clear in the economy of the narration here what the meaning really is. And also, if that's the reason why you want to break through the enemy lines, it sounds like you don't actually evaluate the enemy lines to be so, from in front of you on the left, to be so strong after all. The point, though, here is that the Edessans attacked the enemy lines. And here is the plot twist, right? The ambush, the Turkish stratagem, flank attack, because it says, sed subito decem milia turcorum ab insidis surgentes, arco et sagittis ferociter eis in facem occurrerunt, graviter eos assilientes, et sagittis vigentes donec tota magnus in fugam versa est. Et his ali captivati et uccisi sunt, et plures exilio aeterno abducti. So what happens? Said, but, adversative, right? Said, immediately, subito. 10,000 Turks equipped, with bow and arrows, fiercely emerged. Abin cities, so here from an ambush, right? So from a concealed position, whatever you want to call it, but the fact that insidious is this kind of this stratagem that they had attracted them evidently into. And it doesn't even say from which side they attacked, but Abin cities could, this is what the sources have interpreted, like, the Turks attacked from the flank. But apparently, at least from Albert Wagen, there is no evidence of that. If I don't remember wrong, but we will read it now. Not even in the other sources. It's just anything like, they came from the flank. The side doesn't even really matter, right? It could have been like, a concealed position of sort. Like, we wouldn't know from what, behind which natural barrier, so on. But the point, though, is that here, the Edessans are assaulted. They are at sagittis vigentes, so they are basically pierced with arrows by the Turks. And it says tota manus, so all of these manus, this handful, literally, it's the same like the maniple theoretically, but here it says the term manus is not aches, right? When we have seen that here the term is very flexible, because for example, when the Crusader army arrayed, you find the source that says viginti aches, so literally saying 20 aches. Then when he talks about the one of Bohemond and Tancred, says it's singular, achem, in accusative. So it's very flexible. Now it says manus, right? Considering that the source has said specifically Baldwin, Joscelin, and other illustrious knights, right? It didn't say an aches, a rank by itself. But in any case, this manus, tota, all of it, is infugam versa est. So it's broke, like it fled completely. And then it says of them, many are, they are captured and killed, and others are eventually brought in eternal exile. So the sources goes on and says, in hoc tam crudeli diffugio clerici. So here there is a passage in which it says that the Muslims captured 18 among monks and priests that were comforting the Milites Christi, so the Knights of Christ, during the battle. Right? This is very interesting because it's actually what happened. And the Muslims took this 18 among priests and monks and beheaded them, right? So this is brutal, but still a detail. It's not part of the tactics, but just from the prisoners. And also Benedict, Bishop of Harran, if I'm not wrong, is taken and deported, and here is captured Baldwin. Yes, Baldwin will be the future king of Jerusalem, by the way. He was Count of Edessa, right? And Baldwin Le Bourg, right, will become. And here the source says about him that Princeps Ros Nimium avidus cedis et incautia celerans nec victrices aquilas boemundi opportune prestolatus dictus captus et abductus est. So what does this mean? This is very interesting, actually, because Albert is reproaching Baldwin for because he was excessively nimium avidus of slaughter of the enemy. It says et incautia celerans. So he had uncautiously accelerated, right? Nec victrices aquilas boemundi opportune prestolatus. So which means literally that he had accelerated imprudently without waiting for the victorious eagles of Bohemond to have been seen opportunely, right? And there, victus captus et abductus est. So he was defeated, captured, and deported. So what does this mean? Well, this is interesting because it sounds like there was a plan of some sort, right? Bohemond, and this is I think the hint that gave to the scholars the idea that there was a feint flight to be, or some kind of other stratagem that the Crusaders had coordinated to put up, right? But it could be but it doesn't quite explicitate which kind. But what it says explicitly is that he had not seen the eagles, so the symbols, the ensigns, the insignia of Bohemond, of the Antiochenes, and had attacked anyway. This is interesting because, in my opinion, it really solves the account of Albert, because it substantially sounds like, remember the auxilium to which the Edessans would have run to for helping Bohemond in the battle to be eager. Well, that sounds very much like it. It's not much of a stratagem, in my opinion, but it sounds simply like, the Antiochenes were still fighting, were still winning over the Turks, but they, at that point, if they were winning, they would have been maybe the ones who would have had to attack the Turks on the flank by making a convergence on the left and support, and to catch the Turks between two fires. But no, the Edessans attacked before the Antiochenes had made something out of their victory on the right, and the Turks had set up this trap against them, and they got defeated. So this is, in my opinion, how it's more logical to interpret this. I don't see any idea here of the Antiochenes being occulted, being hidden, concealed in any way on the field to perform an attack from who knows which side, right? Normally, if there was, in this case, a left and a right on the battle line, whoever one of the two sides eventually converges on the other when it's won. And Albert's account sounds very much like that the Edessans were kind of jealous. They wanted to emulate the Antiochians and just break through the Turks without waiting, which would have been better at that point. And because they wanted to prove maybe they were as good as the Antiochians that they had called for help during the campaign. So that is, in my opinion, the interpretation of Albert's account, and it's much simpler and less kind of conspirational, I would say, than this idea that the Westerners here would have had to put up the same exact tactic that the Turks were performing. How? How do you do it concretely? Even when, I can understand that maneuvering, but, a flank attack in this regard, there is no evidence of it of sort, right? And you do that only with a contingent that is concealed in a way or another, and here it seems like the two contingents were symmetrical. Like, it doesn't say that there was infantry from one side only or the other, but let's go on a while because the account is not ended. It says, ad exo, furthermore, Tancredus, this is interesting, a presenti cede Turcorum gloriose descendens, sed sinistro nuncio consternatus sine moracum suis advans, Turcos in Baldevini suorum strage factus, victoris in sequitur ut captivos executeret. He was reported by a grim messenger. Here, Sinistro, I don't know where he may even be referred to the left side, but in any case, he ran up immediately with his own. But the phrase afterwards says, sed maturata via elapsisum, so basically they made to find a way out of the battlefield anyway. And then he goes on and says that only the bishop with 3 knights is yes, because there is a point even in the later sources which they basically attempted, this is I think what his translation actually meant, that they tried to free, in fact, the some of the prisoners who were taken on the left side by attacking the Turks as they were carrying them away. Right, this will be clearer in the next account, and so they tried. So in fact, they managed to free here the bishop, and so this is what it meant, right? But the point though is that then it was very late. It was almost night, because the next phrase it says, and basically the Antiochians retreat in their encampments, Bohemond and Tancred, right? Says cum universo comitato suo ad refocillandos artus, right, nimio bellorum pondere hoc die fatigados. So here the picture is that the night falls and the battle is over, or better, the engagement in general is over for now, and the Edessans have been wiped out, right? Many of them are captured. There is this attempt to save some of them. So there is some clash here we can't fully see, and the next sources will be clearer about. But basically the Antiochians, here the source stresses that basically almost all of them, since they have been victorious, they had not clashed with other Turks, with other major Turkish divisions, came back to their own encampment to refresh. They were exhausted from the day, right? So, and then the day after, here the battle basically is over, because they revert to Harran. Harran surrenders to the Turks, because they don't see and so they basically, Baldwin eventually retreats. These are all the next paragraphs. And that's how the battle went, right? So this is actually a defeat that makes you understand it is so, because evidently one side of the apparently, here it sounds somewhat specular, for which the official, let's say the most credited version says that the Turks had won the field by destroying the Edessan contingent, which definitely was a very heavy blow for the Crusader army in the first place. We didn't know exactly the ratio of strengths between them within the same crusading army. And it seems, though, that the Antiochians had also inflicted some losses to the Turks. We've seen it, 500 cavalrymen, but not, or more. Actually, let me see if there were five. No, it was 500, right? So given that the Turks were 30,000 or even up to 60,000, according to the source, this sounds effectively like just a small part, right? Still, this account doesn't tell us much about who was, how many troops were confronting themselves on the battlefield, right? It doesn't really say that. It doesn't really say what the Antiochians found in front of themselves, how many Turks, right? Was that the entire, I don't know, Turkish left? Was it just a smaller party? Also, it's interesting when it says that the 30,000 Turks appeared on the right flank, which at that point sounds like the Turkish right flank, maybe against the Edessan left. But we have seen that the Edessans didn't give much a damn about them, and yeah, maybe they attacked this main unit, but they were attacked by the Turkish ambush from the flank, from the rear. We don't really understand this. From this account, it doesn't sound clear. There is a lot of information that is not purposely omitted, but is simply not present, right? And this is it. Bohemond and Tancred retreat, Baldwin is being taken prisoner. That's pretty much it. So let's pass now to Ralph of Khan, right? Which says something that we can observe more directly. This is translated, but we have not had particular problems to translate from Latin here before. So Ralph of Khan, chapter 148. Says the Assyrians go to war and surround Edessa. Right, this is the work is the famous Gesta Tancredi. Right, the Assyrians here are naturally the Muslims, classicistically speaking, and go to war to surround Edessa. A battle ensues. So let's simply read it and comment it in the meanwhile. It says, in the meantime, the Assyrians went to war and surrounded Edessa and its neighborhood with an infinite multitude. So a lot of Turks even here. When asked for aid, Bohemond did not delay. He crossed the Euphrates accompanied by the Patriarch Bernard, Tancred and Joscelin, who at the time ruled the city of Marash, bringing whatever troops he had. When the Turks heard about Bohemond's advance, they left Edessa and went off a short distance, still avid for battle, but pretending otherwise. Right. So here's probably the feigned flight of the Turks. That is a strategical level, simply attracting the Crusaders. We have seen it many times, Manzikert, the Hattin, right? This marches, right? That in case of Hattin at least was to reach another place, but always in the case of Manzikert, an entire day of march to try to give battle to the Turks that retreated constantly. So this is what happened again, and Ralph is pretty good at describing this, because he says the Turks simulated flight with a certain adroitness, and so that they could attack their enemies without warning as they followed behind. The one side was to pass along known paths to safety, while the other side headed towards danger along unfamiliar roads. Right, so the Turks are attracting Crusaders on a difficult ground. The one side proceeded towards supplies, while the other side carried on into hunger. The one side was to advance towards reinforcements, while the other side continued towards losses. Thus they went on for a period of 3 days. Like other sources say 2 days, right? So this is a very long march after all. And it reveals a bit of crusading confidence after all. But, the Battle of Harran here, maybe, since the sources do not explicitate it particularly, or do not overly emphasize it, like, for example, the ones for the Battle of Hattin, right? But this is kind of the same identical picture. Like, this terrible advance on tough ground for days, for multiple days under Turkish fire, and meant sometimes as arrows, sometimes literally. Like we know that the enemies used to light up fires for smoking the enemies and making them thirsty. All of these tricks, right? So these were pretty standard, and they were carried out probably also in this case. Thus, they went on for a period of 3 days until they passed beyond the city of Harran. And this, in this, the Gesta Tancredi are a bit like different from the other accounts, because they say that Harran was reached only at this point, whereas, as we have seen from many accounts, what the informators, the Crusaders had attacked Harran to distract the Turks from this, and it had functioned. So here the source maybe is not particularly reliable, but anyway. By the way, Harran, as you know, is Carra, the same place where the Romans got ambushed by the Parthians. The same. So lots of similarities. Sometimes also in the tactics of the places, of the local military culture, and so on. With one side deceiving and the other side being deceived. This went on until they reached and crossed the river Kobar. The delay in battle was now sufficient for the Turks. They gave up their deception and prepared for war with their mouths and with their hands. They thought that our men would be played out, that there was no hope of escape now that they had crossed the river, and that their strength was gone. Right, so this is very important because it sums up what we were talking about before. The Turks were trying to wear out the Crusaders to make it past the river, and this is important because, as we will see now, there's this dramatic route across the river that Albert of Aachen doesn't talk about actually, but that was very advantageous for the Turkish pursuit, right? And there is a bit of more of play about this. Naturally, the fact that the Christians had advanced up to the river is important because there's a major source of fresh water is fundamental for maintaining every army. It doesn't matter even if you're in Syria or anywhere else for that matter. It's large amounts of men and horses, etc. need this immediately close amount of fresh water to water basin to satisfy their thirst, right? And we can imagine the Crusaders had struggled up to that point for reaching the same river, right? And this was all part of the Turkish plan in a way. That even here, don't think the Turks were having it easy. Like from the western side, looks like the Turks are typically treacherous because they do these things and they attract the enemy in a trap. But the Turks were like, this was an incredibly difficult thing to do for them as well, and they were risking in turn. But that's what war is, and both sides were, as we were saying before, the odds are generally much more balanced in these battles, and they do what they see. And they thought, the Turks, that our men would, we've already read it, but it's more to be played out, that there was no hope of escape now that they had crossed the river, and that their strength was gone. So this is also another hint about the fact that seemingly the crusading army had passed the river entirely, right? That there was no thing like you read in these other accounts that circulate on the internet that one chunk had crossed the river and the other didn't, right? I personally haven't found it yet, or at least in the other sources, that there is no evidence of this. And even if you want to surprise the enemy, still that's kind of like there is an obstacle in the middle. That's not really the best way to put up a surprise in that way. Then Ralph goes on and says, not long after the thought came the deed. The Christians were marching along in 3 columns. Now, this is also another very important thing, because it says, Bohemond held the right, Count Baldwin held the left, right? Neither one was wearing his armor, but both were unprepared and both were unaware of the plans of the enemy. Tancred was stationed in the middle. He was prepared, ready, and armed. Now, this I like very much this account, honestly, because it recalls the deployment of other crusading armies, like we have seen, for example, in the Third Battle of Ramla. The main, the most common deployment in many ways were these 3 divisions, right? And even in Albrecht's of Aachen account, we've actually seen that this bipartite organization of the crusading army, it's not something you find often in battles out there. Like 2 sides only. Like there were usually 3. Right? There are more things you can do, especially in big battles, right? If you have an articulate plan, 3 divisions maintains a good level of flexibility, yet also a good amount of unity, right? Of compactness, and therefore it's more of use. And here the source says explicitly that there were 3 divisions, that there weren't 2. And according to me, he is right. Here's the source, according to me, is more reliable than the other. And even Albrecht of Aachen actually betrays a little bit in his account this fact that sometimes he talks just of Baldwin, sometimes he talks just, especially for the Antiochians, he talks mostly about Bohemond, or talks about only of Tancred. It sounds like they were split after all, and that they weren't just like half and half, right? He doesn't say it explicitly, in fact, but he treats essentially the Edessens and the Antiochians as the 2 main chunks, and it doesn't give other subdivisions of the army. Here, Ralph of Caen actually says explicitly that these divisions were 3, and he matches actually with the account of Albrecht of Aachen, because he says that effectively Baldwin was on the left, like that account, and Bohemond on the right. Tancred instead was in the middle, right? And this is really very interesting. And more, he says that the Christian left and right weren't prepared for battle. Remember where Albrecht of Aachen says that the Crusaders had barely formed up their ranks when the Turks started the fight. Well, here it says it explicitly, even more, as we will see. So Tancred actually, that appears towards the end as a protagonist, not even in Albrecht's account, even not more as Baldwin, probably has to do with this, has to do with the fact that there was this tripartite, hence more complex composition, both of the Christian forces, and I presume of the Turkish ones. Right, because in other battles they were deployed in the same way, and after all, it was normal to try even to match the enemy's array to cope better with their tactical flexibility, right? So definitely the picture is more complex than the one is observed in Albrecht's account that eventually gave life to the credited version. Google the Battle of Harran. There is this picture that I've inserted also in my among the pictures in here that shows this bipartite section, right? I'm not saying it's completely wrong, because we don't actually know how the battle went. We weren't there, right? And the sources are conflicting. Nobody tells us that one is better than the other. But in general, there's been this over-reliance on the first account, and the others not so much, and the historians mostly bypass this, like saying, okay, well, yeah, the accounts are conflicting, but let's tell the story. But yeah, but have you analyzed the sources like we are doing now? Probably yes, but why did you choose to make it so simple, right? I like very much Ralph of Caen's account. It's very detailed, and it says something very sensible even afterwards, because it says the Turks were not far in front of them, almost as if they were serving as a vanguard, right? Had scouts nearby reported the situation among the Franks. This is also very fascinating because it was a typical Turkish tactic, so the source is very spot on. To in fact harass, as we have seen, the crusading the enemy armies by being actually very close to them with their horse archers, with their skirmishers. Naturally, the bulk of the Turkish forces were more far away to be committed only at the moment of the major combat. But so that basically the enemy would be under constant pressure, right? That there was not a moment of rest, right? The enemies would advance and they would be always inside of these Turkish horse archers as if they were their own vanguard rather than the enemy forces, right? And the Turks here are therefore informed of the array of the Franks, and the Turks leave the Franks basically in this array for the whole day long, right? And this is even not so different from Albrecht's account, right? Because he says, that the troops arrayed at sunrise, and that the Turks attacked while the ranks were not formed, but yet. Or they were barely. So, but it doesn't specify what the attack began. So we shouldn't be tricked that this began actually at the main engagement. Attack began at sunrise, which is also meaningful because it sounds like if the Turks had seen that the enemies were of course they were maybe trying to tire them even more, right? So to fully exploit this, we don't know why the Franks were not fully ready and armed, right? But the point here it says, and the source is problematic in the sense it says, as the fourth quarter of the day began and 3/4 of the day had gone by, the Franks began to make their camp in order noted above, right? So here an entire day more passes, right? So it's not that they had the battle started from the morning and it ended at night, right? Probably lasts some hour, but still here Ralph adds this extra detail that the Franks not only had come up across the river, but they basically marched for another day, right? It says, when the Turks learned from their scouts what was prepared and what was not, they launched a sudden assault. They avoided Tancred's force and attacked the armies of Bohemond and Baldwin. Neither of one was able to put on his armor, so they fought with bare heads and chests. The Antiochians struggled to resist, but uncovered as they were forced to abandon their baggage. Then, while the enemies were busy with their baggage and rich goods, our men caught their prey. Thus, although they were skilled in war, it was the loss of their property which saved their bodies. They considered themselves likely to have lost their goods, right? This is even more problematic. So what happens here is that the Franks even started to mount up their own camp, and that's where the Turks attacked them. They avoid the Christian center where Tancred is fully armed with his troops prepared for combat, and they attack the weaker Antiochians and Edessans on the right and left, and here it doesn't talk about the Edessans, but it talks about the Antiochians that basically cannot resist the Turks, right? The way he puts the thing is that they basically retreat somewhere, probably, I don't know, to a nearby hill, possibly, and that's maybe a reference of the hill, but it's just hypothetical, and abandoning their own baggage so that the Turks pillage it, right? Which also doesn't speak quite well for the Turkish discipline in that regard, because they should have pressed on the enemy that was shaken, right? And the source even says, it's not much that the Antiochians were skilled in combat, but basically they got saved from the fact that the enemy stopped looting, right, and what they had left behind. So here there is even a situation of crisis of some sort, because after all, if you abandon your baggage, it probably you have moved somewhere else, right? So even these divisions are probably not very close to support each other. At least at the moment of the Turkish attack, they try to maintain their positions, and they're a bit out there, each one on their own. The Antiochians managed to rally in a way, but we don't know how and where. And then Ralph passes to the Edessans. It says, but then the men of Edessa suddenly failed. Right? They were not able to protect their baggage or themselves. Baldwin was captured and led away in bonds. The unlucky Archbishop Benedict was also captured and carried off. Both of the chained men had baggage loaded onto their back shoulders. But when the latter was being led away in front of Tancred's force, he shouted, Tancred, help me. May the suffering of Benedict move you to pity. When the son of the Marquis, which is Tancred, had heard this shout and recognized whence it came and who it was, he charged out, freed him, and led him back to safety. He provided the liberated man with a mule. Because he said that he would aid him, he consoled the trembling man and stayed with him, assuring him that there was nothing to fear. At that point, the approaching night and the arguments of his soldiers opposed Tancred's desire to go into battle. The same objection also restrained Bohemond, who preferred to hold off fighting until the next day. In the meantime, the darkness of the night enclosed the world. So after sending out their scouts, the leaders went to sleep. However, the common troops, who did not have available the comforts of the court, considered ways of fleeing, as they feared the fate that they so set out for them on the next day. So this paragraph is interesting because it says, first of all, that the Antiochian left is wiped out. So it matches with Albrecht's account. Baldwin is taken prisoner, and Bernard is saved. So from this incursion by Tancred, that, however, as the source says, didn't give battle proper. He probably went with some troop, but not in the entire force is committed to the fight, right? Because it says, at that point, the approaching night and the arguments of his soldiers opposed Tancred's desire to go into battle. So even if he had saved Bernard from this party of Turks that were coming back probably from the crusading left, passing in front of Tancred's line, which is also pretty risky and doesn't explain why they didn't simply retreat behind, from their on their right without passing in front of Tancred's. And this matches also with Albrecht's account, where he says that the Antiochians, Tancred specifically, runs for Bernard and for the captives, the Christian captives of the Turks, and he rushes personally and saves Bernard and other 3 knights. So this is realistic, and it's beautiful also when the source says the darkness of the night enclosed the world. So here it's interesting because both Tancred and Bohemond, as we've seen here, is being defeated, right? He has been forced to abandon his baggage, and he is retreated somewhere we don't know, but he was still capable of fighting. And both Tancred and Bohemond wanted to fight the next day, but the rest of the troops, the common troops, right? So here there is the cliche of the thing that naturally the knights wanted and the leaders wanted to continue the fight, but the common troops, hence the commoners, probably also the Armenians that were together with them, said, okay, now we are out of here, we don't want to fight. There were also more than the others that were difficult to control individually en masse, and during the night they could slip away, and the situation evidently was not florid, because the Edessans have been knocked out of battle. The next day, the battle would have mounted up again, and the odds were definitely not very favorable. With 1/3 of the army wiped out, 1/3 shattered, and just another fresh, but the enemy superior in number, and the situation, that also the terrain not being very convenient for the Christians. Yeah, it sounds pretty much like even this source wants to, for example, to highlight the fact that the nobility was cool. This and the the justification of the defeat was this commoners that didn't want to fight, but quite likely the situation was pretty grim, right? And in fact, here there is the other chap, the final paragraph says, the river stood in the way of their retreat, right? So even here, it's clear that differently from the Vulgata, this credited version that circulates on the internet, but both the Edessans and the Antiochians had crossed the river, right? There is no evidence here of these troops having mounted up any kind of feigned flight against the troop. That there's or prevented one, but there's nothing up that to support that, right? It says the river stood in the way of their retreat. It had one ford. The remainder of its course was blocked by steep banks. Guards watched this one area as if it were a gate so that it would not offer a means of escape to the terrified people. They could keep those attempting to flee away from the ford if there were only a few of them. However, when they were many, this was not possible. The orders of the commanders were disregarded, when the fear of death disturbed the troops. So they rushed towards the prohibited gates, and the overflowing crowd grew larger. Some threw boards from one bank to the other in a different spot in order to use them as a bridge. The guards were forced to retreat in face of this force. The guards then roused Bohemond and complained about the force used against them, which ended in their flight. The news also roused Tancred. Both of the leaders now prepared to retreat, having learned that they had been abandoned by their men. Some went on ahead while Tancred delayed to remain behind. He would take up the role of a wall against the spears of the enemies following behind. Others prepared to flee. Some used their bridles and others their spears. God took mercy on his people. The Turks remained unaware of the retreat. This is also interesting, that at night there is no clear understanding of what the enemy is doing, and this whole account it sounds very reasonable because everything combines about this Turkish attitude of not overwhelming the enemy forces, probably because they weren't so strong themselves, right? And the same fact, as we will see at the end, that these troops now were still out there, that the Christians returned to their camps after the battle was over, and that they eventually retreated the day after or during the night, is quite consistent with the fact that this was like an important defeat for them, especially for the county of Edessa. It was, in fact, the one that suffered the most of this thing. But for the Antiochians, in fact, the thing had not been over, and it had not necessarily been the case because there were fewer, right? Or simply they probably really composed a good part of the whole army, maybe as much as 1/2, possibly even more. Who knows, actually? But the point is that it was a mighty force, and that at the end of the day, still had the possibility of retreating, of encamping. So this is not like a massive defeat. In tactical terms, the Turks remained unaware of the retreat. They remained in a deep sleep while the careful flight of the Christians adorned the paths with precious baggage. They threw away clothing, tents, silver and gold vessels, and whatever else was heavy and could delay them. They even cast aside their weapons, which were the protectors of their lives. Rain made the roads bad, transforming dust into mud. Demounted soldiers and foot soldiers were impeded by the slippery path and by the burdens that they were dragging behind them. Patriarch Bernard was there. He fled with those who were fleeing, and his mud-soaked mule was held back with those who were delayed. No one opposed them, but it seemed as if there were an infinite number of enemies around with drawn swords and bows. His eye was disturbed by the fear around him that was manifest no less in their spirits than it was obvious on their faces. Therefore, calling on his fellow participants in this retreat, he called out, "Listen to me, my sons. Hear your father. Cut away this oar which hangs from your poop. It's not only not directing your course, it is holding you back. Cut it off, I say. I shall not blush while in this storm to press the back of this animal after it has been cut free and enlightened. Cut them free, just as God cuts away your sins. I absolve everything from those who cut it away. Many passed by with closed ears, for a blind fear closed them. No one cared for another, each person afflicted by his own misery. Now, one fellow, removing himself from the fleeing troops, accepted this remedy in exchange for the aforementioned remissions of sins. Thus, two matters were absolved with one act. The soldier was absolved from his sins, and the beast was absolved of its burden. When the soldier cut off the burden, he was sowing blessing and reaping them as well, since the patriarch blessed him with his mouth, his earth and right hand. Thus the soldier was a reaper, having reaped both the burden and the blessing at the same time. They rode together to Edessa, the archbishop riding with the men who had given back to him the ability to ride. Here it doesn't actually say much about the losses. It sounds like a bit too much, actually, as if, after all, this didn't turn into a disaster, right? Which probably did after the battle, or the retreat, right? As it happens for many battles. And I would like to read just a passage from Matthew of Edessa's chronicle about the battle proper. Matthew of Edessa is a local Syrian source, and here I have to find the passage because it doesn't tell much about the battle itself. In fact, here I have Fulcar of Chartres, even ibn al-Qualanisi, but they don't say much. The only thing ibn al-Qualanisi says is interesting. It's 10,000 dead. As far as I understand, other Islamic sources quantify like to even 12,000, claimed by Ibn al-Athir and other sources, or others, so I don't remember exactly. So that's, as far as I understand, what most that they contain. If they talk about the heel and the concealment, I repeat, I don't know it. Right, so it seems strange, in fact, that the normal version has introduced these details without an actual proof. But here in Matthew of Edessa, we find an element that may explain partly the account of Albert of Aachen, because he talks about Baldwin, right, and says, so now the troops had advanced, right, they had been attracted by the Persians, as the source says, by the Turks, actually. Are called like this also because of the Turkish, like the Seljuk Turks were heavily Persified, as you know. But these are kind of class, synecdoches. But it says, the Count of Edessa and Joscelin had grown arrogant in their thinking and had positioned Bohemond and Tancred far distant from their own troops, saying, "Let us go first and take the name of victors." Now it happened that when Baldwin and Joscelin encountered the troops of the Turks, it was a ferocious and intense battle in the foreign land of the Tajiks. The troops of the Persians conquered the troops of the Franks, and divine wrath fell upon the Christians, for the entire country was filled with corpses and covered with blood. More than 30,000 believers, and the district became depopulated. So here is a mix of all, I presume not just the Crusading army, but the whole district became depopulated because the Turks, after battle, began to massacre everybody around. And it says, the Persians seized Baldwin, Count Eudes, and Joscelin and took them into captivity. The others survived. Says the others who had been stationed in the rear survived with all their troops. These troops took the Frankish tyrants and fled to the city of Edessa to refuge. So even the source states, alongside Albert of Aachen, one, that the Edessans were far away from the Antiochians, and still this doesn't fully match with what was said by Albert, at least in terms of the fact that the Antiochians defeated part of the Turks. And the thing at that point is fascinating, actually, because if here the source Maturata doesn't, he says, he doesn't say, at least here I think it's the addition, it says those others who had been stationed in their rear, but it doesn't sound very much, it's not explicit that Baldwin and Jocelyn had deployed the Antiochians back. It says far away, and it's obvious that it's probably back or behind. But since Baldwin wanted to join and come to the help of the Antiochians, he went through the Turkish lines, and he was attacked from the rear. Right? Those are two different directions. Right? If they had been back, he would have had to go back. But then, where were the Turks at that point? They had this Edison division would have to pass in front of them, and they didn't move. If they had stationed, let's say, at a point in which they had gone past it, and without attacking them, it's not quite consistent, right? There is no clear understanding of what this is really about. It's possible, of course, that these divisions had distanced each other. We've seen in Ralph of Khan account that these divisions were maybe 3, and maybe they went in echelon. But again, Runciman is right. The sources are conflicting, right? There is no way to properly recollect the thing. Here, Maturata is also a bit of a biased source because he speaks badly about the Franks. There's also an episode in the same part which is kind of disgusting, but it was all collected to this omen, to this bad behavior of the Franks. They were depicted as sinners and so on, and so this idea also that the Franks are arrogant and they wanted to fight first than the others. Yeah, it could be, definitely could. But rationalizing a bit more to military logic, like, there might have been a hurried movement, but what about the rest of the thing? We could reconnect this considering that Maturata, as Albert says, that most of the Antiochians had survived, that they didn't suffer many losses. Whereas in Ralph of Khan we see that actually Bohemont's division had suffered a blow, and that their troops began to retreat. And here it even says, that he says actually that in fact that this is the case, but also a lot of people died after the battle because of naturally of devastations and so on. But as you understand, there is no clear proof of what happened, and most definitely I don't think there is a proof of the fact that the Antiochians had been left as a reserve for an ambush, right? Here, for example, in Maturata's account, this could be actually the most fitting account for the ambush, for the Christian ambush, because maybe the Antiochians had been left behind, but how? Here, after all, it's explained in a different way. Like, it's the Edessans that had advanced because they were arrogant, they didn't want to share the glory with the Antiochians. But they might have been left behind. But the other two accounts that we have read also speak pretty clearly of a situation in which, after all, the army had proceeded together. They had crossed the river together. Here there is no mention of that river, for example. So, again, I don't find anything about kind of a atypical or unusual Christian deployment compared to the usual 3 divisions, maybe deployed in echelon. Maybe with the left advanced, it's possible, but that's it. That there is no evidence of another tactical sophistication of stratagem enacted. Right. The other sources, Full Carriers of Shah, whoever read it, doesn't say much. It does say the same thing, that basically the Antiochians managed to find a way out, that they managed to retreat. So this actually speaks for the idea that after all, someone made it out of there, chiefly the Antiochians, while the Edessians didn't quite make it. That's pretty much it. And I can't really express a full judgment about this battle simply because we can't properly understand what happened. There is no way to reconcile, at least on the base of these sources that I've read. Then I don't know, maybe the solution is contained in Michael the Syrian, I think I've read it, the anonymous Syrian chronicle, or in Ibn al-Athir, Ibn al-Jayuzi, right? But I haven't found much of even of studies or articles online mentioning this stuff. So it sounds a bit like foggy to me. So I surrender. I give up. I say, okay, I haven't read those accounts. I can't really tell. But on the base of these accounts, it is, as it's normal. You know, the Western sources are more detailed, more logical, more coherent than the Muslim ones are much more like religiously oriented. Like I said, for the glory of God, we've achieved this victory point. But they don't really tell you much, because from their cultural standpoint, it was victory point. There is no need to explain why this happened, right? I found it curiously from some commentators on the battles that have made of Manzikert says, it's not important to say how the battle went. The important is it was the Turks won. There's maybe a legacy of that historiographical attitude, and it's also a way for, it's interesting historically speaking, because it tells you what the point was for them apparently, But so I doubt that in these other sources, including the Syrian ones that are very similar in this regard to the Muslim ones, stylistically speaking, literally speaking, there isn't an enormous deal of evidence. Then if they talk about the hill or the faint flight or whatever, it's probably a very little mention, but if it's out there, let me know. It's enough. I would be very glad to read it. In any case, even in these other sources that I've checked, studies that I've checked, here the Christian feint flight plus ambush is very it's very conjectural. It says possibly, right? So it's really an hypothesis, and I don't think there is any evidence of sort about this. And the best account we have is the ones we have read, actually. So I can't be fairly sure of it. But for the rest, as always, if I lack information, please provide me with one. I'm more than happy to integrate it eventually, maybe even make another video and say, okay, well, let's fill that gap and solve that mystery if there is. But definitely, if an expert like Runciman wrote that that these accounts are reconcilable, it's because it really is, and it wouldn't be strange if they wouldn't. Right, because normally the sources of that time are that complicated and to put together, and there is no, they don't tell the truth, right? History is not about, sources never say the truth. But people who read sources for the truth, I think have a problem with history, because history is not the truth. There is nothing truthful about history. It's just a reconstruction of a historical reality based on the evidence we have at our disposal. And most of it is purely conjectural. And there is truth behind it. And it's something we're trying to envisage, but we can't fully get it, right? So it's really normal. But I must say that I had fun reading this stuff, because especially these allegedly minor battles that are saying, I'm also not, as you know, not even as a medievalist, I'm not much of a crusader history enthusiast. I don't know why. I mean, there is nothing ideological behind it. I simply never gotten interested in them for a reason or another. And I am, thanks to Schwerpunkt, and making this this battle analysis. I find out they're actually very interesting, and they render a picture that is somewhat very different from the one that is normally presented with the Crusades, right? I made a lot of videos about the Crusades on Schwerpunkt by now. There is an entire playlist dedicated to them, and I must say that looking at these battles and their outcome, there is a pattern. I mean, their development, their outcome, there's always a sort of pattern of this idea of the Turks that attract the Christians in a difficult land. They harass them with horse archers and all this stuff. Christians advance. There is this clash that always shows like a more bulky and less mobile Christian force that is attacked by the more volatile and aggressive Turkish forces, and then either one loser wins. But they're rarely clearly outlined battles. It always seems as if one side or the other was just one step away from losing it. And yes, at one point the balance shifts towards one another, but that no contended was like having it easy at that time. We made that video on the Battle of Hattin that is considered, in fact, naturally one of the greatest Crusader defeats. But if you look at least from the tactical history of it, that's freaking mind-blowing, because that battle was about to be won till or lost to the very last, right? And there was ferocious struggles, and most of the reasons is that the forces that were meeting on were quite complementary, right? Normally the Christians had heavier forces but lacked mobility. The Turks had lighter forces but were more agile. So as a consequence, the Christians lacked this capacity of being more dynamic on the field, and the Turks definitely had plenty of that, but they didn't have enough critical mass to launch this devastating attack in the end. And even if they did, they also suffered their losses. So it's always very balanced, right? And I'm looking forward to study similar battles, because we're doing most of Crusader battles here on Schwerpunkt. And for now, this was the Battle of Harran, right? There would be much more to say, I'm sure, about the strategical background and all this stuff, but we study tactics. That's what I primarily get interested in myself, and this stays for battles proper, and that's what we study. In any case, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.